Good evening, greetings from Helsinki. Currently, it's 2 o'clock here. I know it's much later in Seoul. I have prepared a PowerPoint presentation, and I start sharing my screen now. The idea is talk about the final results of the Finnish basic income experiment. These results are not final in the sense that there would not be any new results available. Currently, there is some more work being done to highlight the results even further. But as Professor just said, the final report of the research group was released last week, actually last Tuesday. So my presentation is based on those results, and I'll give my interpretation of the results. I think it's important to think about the starting point of the Finnish basic income experiment. Currently, we have one of the most progressive governments in the world. We have a prime minister who's only a female prime minister, and all key government minister positions are held by women. But the basic income experiment was implemented by a government headed by 3 middle-aged men who were all coming from conservative political denominations, and their main interest in basic income was employment effects. Some people have really wondered why the conservative government wanted to experiment with basic income. Perhaps the reason is that the Center Party, which was the Prime Minister's party, they have always favored flat rate benefits. So benefits which are just the same level of benefit for everyone. And the main idea was that the farmers' wives didn't get anything from earnings-related benefits. So they have always favored flat rate benefits. A second explanation is that the Sipilä government, the name of our prime minister was Juha Sipilä. It wanted to portray itself as, in a sense, progressive governments which would base its decisions on evidence-based knowledge, and they wanted to expand this idea of using research knowledge in government decision making, and the basic income experiment was their key program to pursue this agenda of evidence-based decision making. The Finnish basic income experiment gained a lot of international attention. One reason was perhaps the timing, because once Finland decided to implement the experiment, many other countries also made decisions to start experimenting with basic income. I just want to point out a few examples in this map. There was a quite extensive experiment rolled out in the province of Ontario in Canada. Unfortunately, it was called back before it was fully implemented. Another example is a very extensive basic income experiment in Kenya. There's also one in India, and as you see, also Korea is highlighted here, because in Gyeonggi province you have the youth dividend, which is not actually an experiment. It's a fully blown basic income program for young people. There are also some other examples from Europe. There was a basic income experiment in the city of Barcelona in Spain. There was also actually 5 different experiments in the Netherlands, and the final results from an experiment in the city of Utrecht were released also last week. But now I'll talk about the Finnish basic income experiment. There were a few misunderstandings around the experiment. We have a very strong basic income Earth network movement, or a very strong advocacy movement for universal basic income. And many people thought that the Finnish experiment would be an experiment with UBI, but that's not the case. The condition, I mean, UBI is there are no conditions in UBI. In our case, the condition was that basic income was only for those people who were unemployed, and not only for all unemployed people, but for those who were long-term unemployed or young people with no work history. So it was a partial basic income aimed only for those who were on this flat rate unemployment benefit. And since it was just a partial basic income, it was not possible to evaluate the kind of dynamic system level effects of basic income or universal basic income. But what was really special about this experiment was that it had a very rigorous scientific basis. It was an RCT, randomized controlled trial, or field experiment. And it was also, what was perhaps the most exceptional was that it was implemented through a law. So it was a statutory experiment. If you were chosen into the basic income group, you couldn't refuse from getting basic income. So in that sense, it was a very, very strong scientific basis. And the experiment period was 2017-2018, so 2 years. And the preliminary results were released in February last year. And the timing of the preliminary report was in February because we had the parliamentary elections in 2019. So the government, which implemented the basic income experiment, wanted to have the results released before their mandate period ended. And the final results were released last week. So the experiment setting was that we had a basic income group of 2,000 people. And the control group were all the other people who were getting this flat rate unemployment benefit just before the experiment started. So those 2,000 people were randomly assigned to that basic income group, and enrollment was mandatory, as I said. The level of benefit was the same in both groups. So the flat rate unemployment benefit in Finland is 560 euros, or approximately $645 US. The target population were unemployed individuals between 25 and 58. The reason for this age bracket was that for younger people, you could expect that they are mostly studying. And there are also some other conditions which apply for young people who are below the age of 25 in terms of their eligibility for unemployment benefits. The official retirement age in Finland is 65, but they thought that it would not make sense to include people who are very close to retirement, since you would expect that they won't be start working more because of basic income, because they would be just waiting for their retirement.
Heikki, could you use a slideshow so that we can see the full screen?
So let me see. So you don't see my screen?
We can see your screen, but could you use a slideshow? So like a full screen.
Oh, let me see. Is it better now?
Yep. That's
okay.
much better. Thank you.
Okay. So as I said, the main aim of the experiment was to see if these people would start working more. The idea was to activate people who were on flat rate unemployment benefit. We had a very good starting point to evaluate the employment effects because we have very good registers on employment, on taxable income, and also participation in employment promoting measures. And basically we were testing three different and somewhat contradictory mechanisms. The first one was that there was no income disregard in basic income. So it means that it was not means tested, the basic income. Normally, if you get a job, you're on unemployment compensation, and then you get a job, you'll lose the unemployment compensation. Actually, in case of Finland, you'll only lose 50% until a certain ceiling, and after that you'll lose your benefit completely. But in case of basic income, you were able to keep the basic income if you got a job, no matter how much you earned. I mean, if you would get a very good job and start earning 5,000 euros a month, you were still able to keep the 560 euros as basic income. The second mechanism concerns sanctions. Sanctions relate to active labor market policy measures. So they are employment promoting measures, which are a kind of a conditional part of unemployment benefit scheme. And the idea is that if an employment office offers you a job or a training, a placement in a training, and you refuse that job offer or a placement in a training, you will lose your unemployment benefit. The employment office will just make a decision that you are not at labor market, you are not active in labor market, so you are not entitled to unemployment compensation. And some people feel that those kind of sanctions, that they are punitive. They don't like the job offers they are getting, or they don't like the training. Some people say that the training is just waste of time. You only try to learn to write your CV, and you go through the same course of CV writing over and over again. And it's no use. It's just waste of time, or actually it's kind of a punishment that you need to go there. But those who were on basic income, they didn't have the sanctions. I mean, they would be able to keep their 560 euros. And actually there was no obligation for them to register at unemployment office. And that's an important point here. And I mean, registering at the unemployment office, and I'll get back to it later on. And thirdly, for them, there was no need to report their incomes. If you are on a regular unemployment benefit and you start getting some work, you need to fill in a blanket. Normally, you need to write in the blanket. If you are unemployed, you just write unemployed. If you haven't got a job for 1 week, you write 5 times unemployed, 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 unemployed. But if you work, then you need to just write, instead of unemployed, you need to write work. And then it means that in some cases you need to pay back some extra benefit which was paid to you as unemployment compensation. But for those who were on basic income, there was no monitoring of incomes because of the point 1 here. if they got some extra income, it was not deducted from basic income amount, basic income amount. So the hypothesis is that because of this income disregard, there would be better incentives to work, and that would encourage people to accept and to get work and to start working. So improved employment. The second hypothesis is more difficult because it could mean that people would become lazy because there's no obligation for them to participate in training or accept job offers, and they could just stop seeking employment and sit on their basic income, sit on their hands and receive the basic income. Or it's also possible that because of the absence of sanctions, people would, just release their creative potential because they don't need to waste their time on those useless training courses. I mean, the training courses which they consider useless, and there is no extra work for them to engage with state bureaucracy, with unemployment office bureaucracy, and they would actually start working more. But generally, the idea was to expect that there would be more work, that this scheme basic income would actually encourage people to start working more. So the employment effects, now I'm getting already into the results. For the first year, there was no statistical difference between the treatment group, so that is the basic income group, and the control group. So that's the result from 2017. And they had three different, or actually two different measures: days in employment and earnings and income from self-employed employment. So they were almost the same measures for both groups. And so no employment effect during the first year. Then the employment effects from the second year, and the results showed that actually the employment increased during the later part of this experiment, so that those who were on basic income, those who were in the treatment group, they worked 6 days more than the control group. And there were especially clear signs of improved employment among families with children and those and migrants, those whose mother language was not Finnish, Swedish, or Sami. But it's what's really tricky here, that the government really changed its directions in terms of activation in 2018. They implemented an activation model which was based on completely opposite thinking than basic income. The activation model was to increase sanctions, and this activation model affected both those people on basic income in some way, and also those people who were in the control group. And it affected those groups asymmetrically. So it's this positive employment effect is a kind of a combined effect of both basic income and activation model. And we can't really tell whether the effect is from basic income or from activation. It's a combined effect. Why is it a combined effect? It's kind of a very detailed question, which concerns the fact that to fulfill the condition for activation model, you were obliged to get a job which would pay even a very little amount of money. If you earned a very little, you could avoid the sanction in the activation model. Another option was to participate more actively in employment promoting measures like training. And actually, if you measure employment not in terms of work days, but in terms of incomes, and you also include the very small incomes, there is no difference between the basic income group and the control group. This makes it very difficult. So actually, the only results which is on solid basis and only results which is can be attributed to basic income experiment is that there was no statistically significant change in the basic income group and the control group during the first year of this experiment. And I think this conclusion is it's a disappointing in a sense that in some other previous studies, you have seen positive effects of basic income on employment increasing towards the end of the trial period. And now we can't really tell if that happened in Finland or not. Of course, the research group said that in the press conference that they were surprised that that this huge carrot, the ability to keep basic income even if you got a job, didn't actually increase employment. So they were expecting it to increase employment, but it didn't. So another issue is that this activation model, which in Finnish it's called aktiivimalli, there was a very strong political opposition against this model. And actually it was one of the main arguments for the Social Democrats to gain power in the elections in 2019. This picture is from Senate Square, which is the main square in Helsinki. And this is from a demonstration where people were demonstrating against this activation model. But then another result was that if you look at the people who were on basic income, how they behaved with regard to employment promoting measures. What was surprising is that so many people from the basic income group, they actually signed in for the employment offices. So they wanted to be included in the activation measures. And this is a very important point. Now, there are some carrots and some sticks which relate to registering at unemployment office. The carrot is that if you participate in a training, you'll get a supplement to your unemployment benefit. This supplement is not very much. I think it's only like 9 euros a day, but it's still a supplement. Another carrot is that for those who had children, they didn't get the child supplements to their basic income amount. But if they wanted to get the child supplements, they were forced to register at unemployment offices. So some basic income recipients signed in to get the child supplements. But on the other hand, people who had registered at unemployment offices, and those people with basic income, if they refused a job offer or a placement in a training, they could lose their child supplement. I mean, they couldn't lose the basic income, but they could lose the child supplement. And also, if a sanction decisions was made at the end of the basic income period, they could still lose their basic income benefit once the experiment was over. So there were some sanctions, and of course it's not a nice thing to get this kind of a sanction decision through email. But if we look at those people who didn't have children, they also were quite active in registering at unemployment offices. And the research group actually concluded that that people had basic income recipients or people on flat rate unemployment benefits, they don't actually dislike the employment services as much as was expected. And people don't have especially some economists, they think that the sanctions in unemployment schemes, that they act as a kind of a deterrent. And the idea is that unemployment, active labor market policy measures, they can be, and they even should be somehow humiliating, so that people, would be more active in getting a job, so that they would avoid those humiliating sanctions and humiliating active labor market policy measures. But that's the result from our case is that's not how people on flat rate unemployment benefit feel. They actually wanted to stay in contact with the employment services. And then another argument, which I think is important here, is that especially when the first results from the Finnish basic income experiment were released, some people said that, well, it didn't increase employment, but it didn't decrease employment either. That it would have shown that people, that they are not lazy. And that's kind of a conclusion. I think it's not very strong one, because we should have included also freelancers and people with low paid jobs into this experiment to see if they would actually reduce their time in work. But we didn't have those groups. So I think you can't really argue, and that was not the point in this experiment to study if people would reduce employment. But if you look at those people who were on basic income and the fact that they signed in for unemployment services, I think that's a very strong signal to say that people are not lazy. Basic income doesn't make you lazy. Even though you get a basic income and you're not obliged to get in touch with the unemployment services, you still do that. And I mean that they had this option to stay in contact with the unemployment services or not, and they choose to stay in contact, most of them. To me, it signifies that people were actually trying to improve their situation, even though there was no obligation for them to do that. So I think this, for me, this is the strongest take-home message from the employment effects. Then I'll turn to talk about the well-being effects. And the reason the word effects is put in brackets here is that we can't really say so much about effects. We can say differences between two groups. The thing is that, as I said, the main point in this endeavor was not to study well-being. So it was not the focal point in the experiment. It's a very important topic in the global debate on basic income, and there is budding evidence of positive effects of basic income from other studies. But the main weakness here was that there was no baseline survey. So we didn't have a baseline. So we don't actually know if people's well-being improved during this experiment or not. We only have results from a telephone survey, which was conducted in October and December, so at the very end of this basic income experiment. It was targeted to all basic income recipients and 5,000 people in the control group. And they used validated questions about different dimensions of well-being, social and financial well-being, subjective health, job search, activity, employment, social trust, and attitudes toward basic income, etc. So here you see the number of people who were interviewed, and you see the response rates. And the response rate is very low, especially in the control group. And now I also want to get back to this activation model, which was very much protested against. And my concern is that among the control group, there are people who were really angry, really pissed off with this activation model, and that's why they gave very negative answers. That could be one reason to explain the very positive results. But in any case, I don't want to say that these results are useless. They are showing convincingly that there were statistically significant differences across a wide range of different key indicators of subjective well-being. So in many cases, people felt better in the basic income group than in the control group. So there was also a higher generalized trust and institutional trust, confidence in the future, and self-confidence. Also less stress symptoms and less depression, better cognitive functioning, and also better perception of financial well-being, and they also experienced less bureaucracy. So that was a very positive result from the basic income experiment. But what's kind of a problematic is that these results are presented side by side. I mean, employment results and well-being results. And in scientific terms, you can't really put them side by side because the evidence is much stronger for employment effects than for the well-being effects. There was also this low response rate. The research group said that the response rate is similar to other studies, other surveys, and I think that's quite true. So people normally they don't want to answer to surveys, so there is attrition. But they were and they were also able to control for some basic characteristics like age, sex, and region to weight the groups and somehow to deal with the selection bias. But it's in no way they were able to control for all important sources of selection bias. So in this sense, this survey and this well-being side of the results is much weaker part. Of course, it would be possible to study the well-being effects more rigorously by using, for example, medicine reimbursements data or some other kind of register data, and those kind of studies are underway. the results are not still, they are still not available. I just talked with my colleague Kela, Minna Ylikännä, who presented those survey results. And she said that if you compared, I mean, they also asked how many times people went to see doctor, and there was no difference between the groups. So there could be no effects. And of course, this kind of a subjective perception is important as such, and it could be something which you can't measure through any kind of a register data. It's people's perception, and I think it's people's perception, their subjective assessment of their own situation is important outcome on its own right. But of course, what's really a pity is that there is no baseline, so we can't do this kind of a within person assessment to see if their well-being actually improved, or if this is just a kind of a one-time perception of people who were lucky, who felt lucky in being included in kind of a privileged group. The public perception of basic income was quite positive in Finland, and many basic income participants were interviewed, especially in the international media, and I think it was somehow felt that you were kind of, well, lucky that you were chosen into this experiment, and you were treated better than the others, and that could be one reason for the positive effects. So and then finally this final report, I mean the preliminary report included data on employment and also included almost the same data on subjective well-being as the final report. But what's really new is that they had results from 81 qualitative interviews where they studied people's labor market behavior, and whether people actually felt that basic income made difference for them. And some people said that it actually had changed their labor market behavior and affected it. For others, they said that it didn't really matter. But what was really shown through these results, that people have a very heterogeneous circumstances. People on flat rate unemployment benefit, long-term unemployment benefit, they have very different circumstances and conditions. So and people have very different attitudes towards participating in the labor market, and also different perceptions of what's valuable engagement in terms of employment or voluntary work, etc. Autonomy was very much emphasized in the qualitative study, and those findings, they correspond to previous literature on the effects of basic income. Finally, there was also a study concerning the media coverage and public opinion, but I'm not gonna go into that in any detail. So what we can say as a summary of the results, that there were perhaps more positive effects than negative effects in any ways. And there was a huge heterogeneity in the treatment group, which became visible through the qualitative results. And the results concerning the well-being, as I said, they are in accordance with the studies from other countries, studies which have just appeared, like the one in Utrecht, and those who were conducted in the 70s in the US and in Canada. But what's also important to recognize here that people who are long-term unemployed, they face a multitude of obstacles to labor market, especially to open labor markets. So there are some reasons why they have been a long time on unemployment benefit. And those reasons prevent them from reacting to financial incentives. So, I mean, it doesn't really matter if you can keep your basic income, if you get a job, in case there is no chance of getting a job. And I guess that could be a very important explanation for the weak employment effects, because if you just can't get a job, any kind of job, it's not possible to get a one, even though the incentives were improved. And I guess that's kind of a cold shower, especially for those economists who have a very strong view of Homo economicus kind of view on people, that they are free to decide and to act, and they react very strongly to financial incentives. But the findings from this experiment tell us that there are other things which matter more. Those things, they may relate to their outdated labor market skills. They might relate to their health status, or they might relate to their attitudes. So those things are important. So there were some notable setbacks during the experiment, which I already mentioned. So I think we can just skip this part, because I want to talk about some implications of basic income experiment. And the current context in Finland is that there is a committee which aims to reform completely the Finnish social security system. This committee was nominated only a month ago, and that committee is going to work for 8 years. So it's a really long-term project. It consists of politicians and permanent expert. I'm a permanent expert representing the Institute for Welfare and Health, and Pasi Moisio is coming from the same institute, and he's chairing the committee. So basic income results, they will be interpreted in the context of this committee. I think there is not enough support for a full-blown basic income in Finland, but our reform could have some elements of partial basic income or participation income. And I think what's really important finding for us is that employment services and employment services are important for long-term unemployed people, and they are not feared, they are not resisted, they are not disliked, and that's kind of a good starting point for developing our social security system, and to develop it to develop services and income transfers side by side. There are also calls for new experiment, and actually our current government program has a paragraph where they discuss about new experiments. But because of the COVID-19 crisis, we don't actually know if there's going to be a new experiment. I'm quite skeptical that there will be a new experiment. If there will be one, it will be a very minor scale experiment, perhaps something to do with reducing bureaucracy or something very minor, because the government hasn't actually started preparing a new experiment. And what we know from this experiment, which just ended, is that you need to have at least a couple of years to plan a decent experiment, especially if you want to implement the experiment through passing a law. So it's a long-term project, and it's also a very delicate, very complicated process. And I think we have learned a lot through our own experience. And I think this experience, what we have gained, can be used in other countries who are interested in conducting a basic income experiment. So the final slide is about the effect of COVID-19 crisis. What we see here is that already some elements of basic income have entered our social security system through the temporary measures relating to COVID-19 crisis. So it's easier for people, for entrepreneurs and for freelancers to access the unemployment security system. There is also temporarily increase in income disregard in unemployment benefit scheme. So it was just increased from 3,000 euros a month to 5,000 euros a month. There has been also in Finland, as in many other countries, there has been proposals of a temporary UBI benefits, like kind of a voucher, a one-time voucher of 500 euros. So that has been proposed. So it seems that there will be less means testing and easier access to benefit because of the COVID-19 crisis. And those features are very much connected to basic income. So I think that's all for my part, and I would be very happy to hear your comments and answer your questions. But thank you very much for your attention.